Okay, we're rolling. Okay, so I just Professor Thomas Bradac from Chapman University Theater Department. So can you tell me your history with theater? How did you get involved with theater and becoming a professor?
Well, it actually started when I was in high school. I started acting, doing some Shakespeare then. I got interested from an English class. I had went to an all-boys school, and they taught The Merchant of Venice, as opposed to Romeo and Juliet, which is normally taught in the beginning of a class, beginning of your academic high school career. So I was intrigued by language. I wasn't particularly great at math, so I seemed to have some kind of connection to language, and that got me interested in Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. And then I didn't do much of it in college. When I got out, I was asked, I was a professor, I was an adjunct professor at Orange Coast College. I was asked to take over the role of King Lear when I was 30 years old. And I did. And I'd been acting on the East Coast and here in the LA area. And I thought that Orange County needed a Shakespeare festival. There wasn't one between San Diego and LA. Mm-hmm. So I formed at the time in the city of Garden Grove, the Grove Shakespeare Festival, which became the second largest theater in Orange County in the 80s.
Oh, that's great.
And then in the 90s, about 91, I left there and came to Chapman University and was asked to teach. And so I founded the second company, which was Shakespeare Orange County, which actually started in Orange at the Waltmart Theater. And we did 12 years in Orange, and then we moved to Garden Grove to the 550-seat outdoor festival amphitheater there, and I did another 10 years there. Total of about 34 years of producing and directing Shakespeare in Orange County.
Amazing.
Helped found an international organization called the Shakespeare Theater Association, which joins the Royal Shakespeare Company and Shakespeare Orange County and the Globe, and all of us into a consortium of people who produce Shakespeare around the globe.
Outstanding. How do you see Shakespeare working in a culture? How does it?
Shakespeare's kind of the roots of the English language. The English language actually is only about 500 years old when you compare it to like Chinese or Hebrew or ancient languages. It's a polyglot language which forms Norwegian and German and Italian and French and Anglo-Saxon, and that forms the roots of the English language. So Shakespeare was at a nexus of where language was transitioning from almost entirely oral culture into what is now a literate or written culture. So Shakespeare himself was writing orally for an oral audience, and so I would say, actually anecdotally, that it's probably better to hear Shakespeare than it is to read it, because it was intended to be heard and spoken aloud as opposed to be read, which was actually put down after his death.
What was the prevalence of literacy in the time that Shakespeare was performing his plays?
Probably about 10% could read and write, and of course most of them were males, because the males were the only people who were allowed to go to schools. There's evidence, of course, of women being tutored, but the schools themselves were only open to males.
And so males played the male and female role.
Yes, which was the tradition of apprenticeship during the Renaissance and during Shakespeare's time. It wasn't that there were actually laws against women performing, but the tradition of apprenticeship of one man handing it down to an apprentice, that was primarily a male occupation. So ironically, when the theaters were closed by the Puritans and the Restoration occurred and Charles II opened up the theaters, the demand by the religious community was that women play the women's characters.
Interesting. It was a cultural force, not necessarily misogyny.
Yes. Yeah, it was. Well, I mean, I think misogyny is still with us, but I think the tradition was one of male apprenticeships.
Okay, that's interesting. With respect to Shakespeare's language, I don't think many people understand how much he contributed to the vocabulary of English.
He contributed thousands of words, and he took words that were in the public usage at the time but hadn't been written down and put them into scripts, so that he was speaking the vernacular of the English language. Plays up until that time had actually been done in Latin. So if you were going to, let's say, Cambridge or Oxford, they were doing the plays in Latin. Shakespeare and his contemporaries at that time were actually producing them in English, so that it was for the common person. Shakespeare is actually one of the last playwrights that wrote for the common man.
I see.
The uneducated, illiterate common man.
Right. Did he coin words, or was he just?
He coined words. He made words up, and then he put words that were in common usage down for the first time. He really formed the basis of the English language as we speak it today.
I'm trying to understand how he could have conveyed a new word in a play that's going on in real time.
Well, we make up words all the time to express need. For example, when I was a kid, the concept of cyberspace or of anything to deal with computers didn't exist. So we had to make up a language, and words were invented to express these new ideas and new machines, and a whole. If I told you had to Google something, well, that word didn't have any meaning. For example, during my childhood,
right.
It would be a silly word,
right.
But the word has a great deal of meaning, and it's also the branding of a company.
Right.
So therefore, language evolves, and language has evolved, and language was evolving during Shakespeare's time, and he was a major force in that. Just like the cyber language is a major force within the world in which we exist.
Okay. Would you say that the people of the time were aware of their participation in the creation of language? Was that slang?
I don't think they were aware of creating language, but I think they were certainly used language as entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
So where we are a very visually oriented culture, they were a very oral oriented culture, to where they would go, where Hamlet says, I go to hear a play. He doesn't say I go to see it, I go to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
So the play of words, punning, one word against another, antithesis, all of that was very entertaining for the Elizabethans, and they could recognize that and hear it when they heard it spoken, when they would hear verse spoken. So poetic kinds of language, not poetry itself, but poetic language, was very recognizable and very entertaining for the Elizabethans.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people consider Shakespeare high culture and sort of out of reach.
Which is ironic, since it wasn't considered high culture when he wrote it. Poetry was considered high culture, and so his sonnets, if he had never written a play, his sonnets, of course, would have been a great contribution to English literature. But the plays themselves were never meant to be recorded or set down.
Oh.
They were set down 7 years after his death into what was called the First Folio, and they were put down by his actors into type at the time to preserve what they had performed, since there was no visual medium to do so. So, but at the time, plays were considered plays. They were done in a playhouse with players, so they were considered trivial.
I see.
And they were for the common man. And he played to the groundlings, so to speak, to the uneducated.
What would you say that, in terms of entertainment, that would be parallel in our time to?
Well, in my time, comic books probably would have been.
Okay.
Although now comic books are very, if you save the ones, the DC comics and stuff, they're very valuable. But that kind of pulp fiction-y, throwaway kind of literature that we wouldn't think much about, WWF wrestling. I mean, akin to bear baiting and stuff. It was spectacle and not considered to be of serious merit.
That's very interesting. I think that's very interesting. How I'm trying to think of ways to convey that to people who were intimidated by coming to see Shakespeare. So
Well, I
how
think
is
like
that
Shakespeare,
possible?
like anything else, is a refined is something that you find an acquired taste. I think you have to allow yourself like a good wine. You first, you don't know what you like, and then as you become more experienced with it, you start to understand that there really is an art to it, and that it actually deals with the human condition in profound ways. And his use of language is such that doesn't have subtext underneath it, that has a multiplicity of meanings, and once you get into that world, I think it opens up a whole different set of possibilities for you. But it's an acquired taste because it's not our normal speech, but it's meant to be entertaining.
Can you still keep the essence of Shakespeare in a play that's not written in that vernacular, in his vernacular?
Well, I mean, it's certainly done. I mean, there are all kinds. I mean, everything from like The Lion King, which is a basic plot substitution of Hamlet. I mean, we use Shakespeare's plot structure and characters are used in popular entertainment all the time. But I think that when and he still is. I mean, if you think about it, the biggest theater on the North American continent is the Stratford Shakespeare Festival. Mm-hmm. The oldest theater in the United States continuously operating is the Ashland Shakespeare Festival, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in Ashland, Oregon, followed closely by the Old Globe in San Diego. These are all theaters based on Shakespeare, and as well as the Utah Shakespeare Festival, which has been going on for about 40 years. They draw huge amounts of people, and they're called destination theaters because they attract people from all over the world. So there is both a following and an acquired taste. It's interesting. I mean, if you bring in someone like Helena Modjeska, who was a Shakespearean actress but of Polish heritage, who basically tried to lose her accent and represent the English language as closely as possible. And she did it because the plays have such substance and are of such a nature that they're universal in their ability to communicate the human condition. And I think that's why people come back to see them again and again.
Right. Okay, great. Okay, that sounds great. That's perfect.